You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 11th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. This is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, Iran goes to the polls on June the 28th. We'll examine the state of politics in the country, how the elections run, what the results might be, and the impact it'll have on the region. We'll continue to analyse the European election results.
To sum up the result of the European parliamentary election, we can presume it best as a telegram that sounds like this: migration full stop, gender full stop, war full stop, Soros full stop, Brussels full stop.
That's Viktor Orban of Hungary, but although he's crowing in victory, his share of the vote has plummeted since the last poll. We'll unpick results from Hungary, then to Belarus, where the country's just announced joint tactical nuclear weapons drills with Russia. Are they just scare tactics, or should the NATO neighbours be even more worried? Japan has introduced new immigration rules. We'll ask what those are and if the human rights of asylum seekers are being respected. We'll have a paper review from Nairobi and a roundup of arts and culture news. Then,
the two crucial things are for publishers is to focus what do we do that's irreplaceable? What do we do that a machine can't do? And there's plenty there for the Wall Street Journal. And the other thing is to really focus on the relationship that you as a publisher have directly with your readers.
Emma Tucker there, editor of the Wall Street Journal and part of a wave of British journalists who've been given prominent positions in the US media. We talked to Chris Lord about what this British invasion means. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The United Nations Security Council on Monday backed a proposal outlined by President Joe Biden for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. New Zealand said today it will send 41 more military personnel to the United Nations mission along the heavily fortified demilitarised zone between North and South Korea as it looks to step up its role in international missions. And 4 American educators from a small Iowa university were injured in a stabbing attack in a public park in northeast China's Jinlin province on Monday. That's according to US media and government officials. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Iran's ex-ruler, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, has been barred once again from running for president after Ibrahim Raisi was killed in a helicopter crash last month. The Guardian Council, a panel of clerics and jurists ultimately overseen by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, approved 6 names to battle for the role at the election on June the 28th. There are no female or reformist candidates. Well, I'm joined now by Bill Law, who's a Middle East analyst and editor of Arab Digest. Bill, many thanks for coming on the show. What is the role of president in Iran?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Georgina. The role of president essentially is to carry out the edicts, the fatwas, if you will, of the supreme ruler, Khamenei. And it is something between ceremonial and something between a political position. The power always resides ultimately with the supreme leader. And Raisi is a good case in point, a very powerful person in his own right. When he became president, obviously was a hardliner. He had a track record going back to the 1980s when he was involved in ordering the executions of thousands of political prisoners at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. However, when he died, there was barely a ripple, really. The stress was on continuity. The decisions that are made ultimately are made by the Ayatollah, the president, not quite a figurehead, but not a person of supreme authority at all.
And I wonder how people have navigated, previous presidents have navigated that relationship with the key Khamenei.
Well, I think it really depends on the personality of the person who's in the presidency. If you look back, there have been moderate presidents who have managed to push their agendas forward. For example, Rouhani, we had the JCPOA agreement, the nuclear deal agreement during his presidency. Khatami was another regarded as a moderate. Ahmadinejad, of course, was seen as very much a hardliner. And he actually, I think Khamenei considered him to be somewhat of a loose cannon because he challenged in a way that the Ayatollah did not approve. And of course, he was, as you mentioned in your introduction, he's been prevented from standing again as president as much as he very much like to do so. It's interesting, too, the number of candidates that have emerged from being mayors of Tehran. I mean, this is a power base, a bloc, if you will, but always the role has to be one where you can push your agenda, but you must do it in a way that you do not upset the Ayatollah. And Ahmadinejad, for example, pushed too hard. He was too provocative. He took too much of the center stage, if you will. To the point where Khamenei was very much annoyed with him.
And is there a clear favourite then in the 6 people that are running?
Well, I think I would look at 2 candidates in particular. Mohammad Bahir Khalibaf, who is very close ties to the RGC. He is a former mayor of Tehran and the current Speaker of Parliament. The second is Saeed Jalili, who is the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. He was involved in nuclear negotiations. I think it's between those 2. A third potential is Alireza Zakani, again, another former mayor of Tehran. What they all share is they're all hardliners. There's I think a fourth candidate that one may consider as something of a moderate. He's a cardiac surgeon called Masoud Pishkian, and he, in some circles, is considered less of a hardliner. I think it's unlikely that he would prevail. I think the battle will be between Khalibaf and Jalili. And I suppose if there was any risk that Pishkian could secure the 50% of the vote required, then one or the other of those 2 hardliners would step aside to ensure that a hardliner wins. I mean, this election is, as you know, the elections in Iran usually are, something of a set piece. I think the thing to keep an eye on is the voter turnout. It was very low in the parliamentary elections, the lowest ever. It was at 40%. There's some analysts are suggesting that this election will slide as low as 30%. It's the only, I suppose, weapon left to the moderate element, the protesters, is simply not to go out and vote.
And I mean, speaking of those protesters, I wonder if years of unrest over the ailing economy and the mass protests sparked by the 2022 death of Mahsa Amini changed that electoral landscape at all.
It's changed, I think, in the sense that people are just at the end of the road looking at elections as a way of securing what they need, what they want. You mentioned the economic situation. It's dreadful. The sanctions have certainly hurt. The protests over Mahsa Amini, Jina, as she's known, she was an Iranian Kurdish woman beaten to death by the security police in detention. All of these protests, and we've seen it previously, 2009, at the end of the presidential election, massive protests, the so-called Green Movement, they've all been crushed, brutally crushed. So what is left to people is to say, okay, I don't believe in this system anymore. The tension that remains, the anger remains very strong. It's about the economy. It's about the treatment of women. It's about the fact that so much money is going to support Iran's foreign adventures in Syria, the support for Hezbollah, the support for Hamas. People are saying, what about us? What about, supporting us? And I think that question this structure does not answer.
And Bill, finally, given, as you point out, that it's a time of heightened tension with the West, Tehran mobilising a regional network of proxy militias to target Israel, how significant will the choice of a new president be to the West, and what might it mean for the region?
Well, I think we just need to look back at when Raisi died. There was uncertainty at the point. How did he die? There were some ideas. Were the Israelis involved? Were the Americans involved? The Iranian authorities are very quick to say, no, this was an accident. The last thing they wanted was to add fuel to the fire. The last thing that the Iranians need or want right now is any deepening of the confrontation with Israel and therefore with the Americans. So it's continuity. They will put in a hardliner. That person will be very much in the mold of Raisi. He will not challenge the Ayatollah. The emphasis will be on holding the line, being consistent, continuity. And of course, we're still faced with a very tense region. So in some ways, almost perversely, it would be reassuring to know that a hardliner is in place. Not good for the people of Iran, but perhaps reassuring for the region.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. That's Bill Law there. And this is The Globalist. It's 8:11 in Budapest and 7:11 here in London. We're continuing to pick apart the results of the European elections. And today we want to drill down to what the outcome means in Belgium, Bulgaria, Hungary and Poland. Well, to do so, I'm joined by Nina dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, good morning to you. The EU Commission makes the decisions that affects most people's lives. So are the European Parliament elections little more than just opinion polls?
Well, in some cases they are, yes, opinion polls that, can really push governments to take huge national decisions, as we've seen in France, where Emmanuel Macron has called this surprise snap election a huge political gamble, largely because his party was trounced in these European Parliament elections by the far right. And remember that the European Parliament does often give these far right parties a platform from which they can build their brand, build their reputation and notoriety, and then use that to try and leapfrog into upending domestic politics. As I said, that's what we've seen in France. We've also seen that type of challenge present in Germany, where Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor at the helm of that weak coalition, saw his party trounced by the AfD. And as a result, he's yesterday, pushed back on this suggestion that Germany should follow France's lead in announcing elections for the moment. But across Eastern Europe, we've seen a slightly different trend. So across Western Europe, we've seen people coming out in these European parliamentary elections to use them perhaps as a protest vote against those established parties. The far-right surge has materialised in some parts of the EU, like in France and Germany. But there's a completely different story happening in Eastern Europe, where we've seen some of the more traditional far-right parties that have been in government there for a long time challenged key EU institutions. In particular, I'm thinking about Hungary. They've seen their vote share be quite eroded by new challengers who say, look, we want a better relationship with the EU. And that's a real problem for people in some of those countries that you mentioned, like Hungary, places like Bulgaria, and also Belgium as well as one of those nations that saw its government crumble over the weekend.
Well, so let's have a look at Belgium in a bit more detail. The expected landslide for the right didn't happen, but nevertheless, it did have dramatic consequences.
Yes, that's right. Well, first of all, the pretext to all of this is that Belgian politics are notoriously complicated. And this is a country that has three official languages. It has three different distinct populations. Obviously, the big economic bloc and linguistic bloc is the Flemish, Dutch-speaking part of the country. Up in the north and the south, you've got Wallonia, which speaks French, which traditionally has a lot of sort of social and economic poverty issues. And we've also got a residual small German population as well there. And so cobbling all of these different interest groups together has always been difficult. And the political system doesn't make it that much easier. In fact, the last time Belgium formed a government, it took 530 39 or 89 days to do so, which was a record, by the way, Georgina. So given the way how these elections panned out over the weekend, they were voting on local elections. They also had national, federal elections, and they had these European parliamentary elections at the same time. The vote has, as you said, swung towards the right, but not far towards the far right, towards this Vlaams Belang. This is the Flemish nationalist separatist party that wants to remove the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium and create its own richer state from that. Now, they have been traditionally, since the 1970s when they were formed, kept out of any politics by sort of so-called cordon sanitaire, as you call it. They've been... Many other parties have said that they refuse totally to work with this right-wing bloc that got, as you said before, more of the vote than it had before, but it was by no means the kind of Flemish landslide that was expected. So, yes, Belgium swung to the right, but it didn't swing as much as expected to the far right. And that means probably, the impetus for, again, campaigning for a Dutch-speaking Flemish state in Belgium has been sapped. For now, it could take a very long time at this rate after Alexander De Croo stepped down over the weekend, the Prime Minister, to form a government in Belgium, given the situation they have now.
What was the outcome in Bulgaria?
Well, in Bulgaria, remember that they've had many successive elections over the last few years as well. And I think they've voted for the assembly there 6 times in 3 years. You'd expect voter apathy to have risen and the vote to have splintered, and that's exactly what has happened. We saw a turnout that was below 30% in these elections. By the way, just like Belgium, they had national elections taking place on the same day as those European parliamentary elections. And the former 3-time Prime Minister, Boyko Borisov, his centre-right GERB party did come out on top, but the vote was really fragmented. You're talking about all the different parties getting about sort of between 25 and 18% of the vote. That also includes, Turkish ethnic minority groups there. You've got GERB, which is obviously on the right. Then you've got further right movements. And just like in many other Eastern European countries, you have some fringe parties that want to campaign to end sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine, to have closer ties with Russia. That's a pattern that obviously you see in some of these Eastern European countries. And that voice for campaigning against helping Ukraine and one day potentially admitting Ukraine into the EU will get louder in some of these Eastern EU countries. And the vehicle by which they will use to try and communicate that message will obviously be the European Parliament floor over the next few years. So fragmented situation in Hungary, but one of the more traditional parties getting about 20% of the vote there.
There was good news for Poland, for Donald Tusk. He's, of course, a former president of the European Council.
Yes, that's right. And apologies, I think I said Hungary before when I meant Bulgaria. Hungary is another story that we should mention. Yes, Donald Tusk, who, of course, came to power as Prime Minister over there in December. That was a big national vote when eventually the ruling Law and Justice party at the time, the far-right party that had dominated Polish politics and brought it right to the brink with a very fractious relationship with the EU, challenging the EU's key tenements on the issues like rule of law, media freedom and so on and so forth, human rights. He had managed to wrest back control of the centre ground when he was voted in December, and he appears to have cemented that position here. So this is a real, referendum on his popularity, and he seized that to say, this showing for my party inside these European parliamentary elections just goes to show that, I do have a mandate for a more sort of centrist, liberal movement here in Poland, so that it doesn't swing back towards the days of the far right that, had such an impact, not just on its relationship with Brussels, but also its relationship with the rest of the world at a time when obviously security and Poland's crucial geographical role, between the war that's taking place over on the other side of the border in Ukraine for now 3 years, and obviously this crucial part of the world where the EU also, its borders dovetail with NATO. Poland is crucial towards that argument. And Donald Tusk is somebody who knows how to navigate the EU well. Remember that he used to be at the helm of the EU Council for many years during the time when this bloc had to negotiate bailing out some of its members. So he's very deft at negotiating both Brussels, but also Warsaw politics as well.
And a very brief look at Hungary, as we say, of course, his Orban's Fidesz party won. The results were down 11% compared to the poll in 2022. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's right. This is the worst showing for the ruling Fidesz party in about 20 years. They haven't had a situation like this since back in 2004. You might remember that was when Hungary had a really significant economic wobble and its currency, the florent, collapsed. And that was sort of around about the time when, Fidesz then appeared to afterwards sort of regain the ground and try and soar in popularity. But as we know, since then, Viktor Orban has become more authoritarian. He's challenged the EU on rule of law. He's been had some of the funding from the EU frozen as a result. And also there's been lots of allegations of corruption. And one of his own lieutenants, Peter Magyar, has now challenged him, formed his own party, and said he's going to highlight all of these corruption issues. He's run a very successful campaign and got a much more significant part of the vote in these European parliamentary elections and more seats than people are expecting. That's obviously going to become a springboard potentially to bigger political change, perhaps on a national level in Hungary. Peter Magyar, this new challenger, says that what he wants to do is mend ties with Brussels so they can get that money that's currently frozen in between Brussels and Hungary unfrozen and have closer ties with other countries. That will be one that you can expect will be music to the ears in Brussels. I'm sure Peter Magyar and his new clutch of MEPs that are going to head towards the Parliament, of which there's quite a few, will be courted very keenly by the power brokers in Brussels to try and, ameliorate ties with Hungary. I should point out also what's significant is that the turnout in Hungary was well over 50%. It was about 16% more in these European parliamentary elections this time round than in 2019. So that just goes to show, he says, that people are engaged, they are voting for him, and they are keen on change in Hungary, even if it comes now with these European parliamentary elections. And that is, a springboard, as I was saying before, towards potentially national change later down the line.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. That's Nina dos Santos there. Now, still to come on the programme, we'll hear why Japan is toughening up its immigration laws in spite of a population crisis. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. I'm Georgina Godwin. It's 22 minutes past 7 here in London. And we'll continue with today's newspapers. Joining me down the line is Navina Couture, who is Monocle's Nairobi correspondent. Navina, good morning to you. Russia's foreign minister was on an African tour. How's that been covered in the region?
Yes, it's quite interesting. I've been looking at the media coverage coming out of Burkina Faso. The Russian foreign minister visited Burkina Faso, the Republic of Congo, and for the first time Chad on a diplomatic sort of visit last week. I think Chad was quite a big surprise, actually, considering that the country used to be firmly allied with France and Western countries. But the new president has been looking to rebalance some of these alliances. If you look at the media coverage in Burkina Faso, there is a lot of applause and talk about the funding and cooperation between Russia and Burkina Faso that has started over the last 2 years since there was a coup in the country. If you look at the media write-up of the Lavrov press conference, he referred to massive waves of decolonization in Africa. It is something that the Russians have been mentioning over and over again, the colonial relationship between African countries and the West, and the fact that the relationship between Russia and these African countries is different. He also talked about his support for counter-terrorist operations. And funny enough, you were talking about European Parliament elections. That is also mentioned in the papers, but in a very snarky way. A former cabinet member is quoted as applauding the outcome of the European Parliament elections, especially the defeat of Emmanuel Macron's party. So a lot of kind of anti-Western sentiment in the press in Burkina Faso. Not a surprise, really.
Let's go to the end of the continent now, and the aftermath after the South African elections. What's the media saying about this?
Yes, again, I think the fact that South Africa is in the middle of coalition talks, that the dominance of the ANC is over, is interesting to most papers on the continent. It is covered in The Nation. It's covered in most East African papers. There's a lot of talk about the death of the liberation movements and the fact that the ANC has now just become a regular political party that has to find smaller coalition partners to form a government, to form an effective government. There's also some advice from other African leaders on how to conduct these talks. But again, it is something that is of interest. It is the biggest economy in South Africa on the continent. It has been a stable democracy. There's a lot of talk on how these talks are going and how the country will basically emerge out of this into basically a new phase.
We're going to go to Ethiopia now and have a look at this transition to green mobility, because it's not going as well as expected.
No, Ethiopia has announced that it has a very ambitious strategy to turn the country into a leading player in green mobility on the continent. It inaugurated the biggest electric vehicle factory in Amhara region last week. But some of the issues are that the financing for these projects is lacking. And I think this has to do with the aftermath of the war. The country is really facing economic challenges and has limited financial capacity when it comes to completing these projects that the government has been talking about. So there's a lack of financing for electricity generation. There was this big project to generate electricity as part of the Grand Renaissance Dam, and to use this electricity to literally fuel this electric vehicle revolution. But some of the financing is really missing. And I think that's what the country will have to address in order to open up the economy as the government wants to.
Let's stay with Ethiopia and the country's probably best known product, which is, of course, coffee. They're having a problem, though, in terms of new EU laws.
Exactly. The EU has a new deforestation law, and this is now presenting challenges for coffee makers in the region. The EU wants to limit deforestation in Africa, and this means that African coffee producers now need to show that the coffee they have produced, they're selling, has not been produced by deforesting, increasing deforestation in places like Ethiopia. So what we see is that now coffee producers are using drones, artificial intelligence in order to show that this coffee has been produced legally and sustainably, and it shows how far issues that are discussed in Strasbourg and in Brussels actually travel, and how people have to respond to it here.
And finally, to Kenya, and the former president Uhuru Kenyatta is accusing the state of withholding part of his retirement package benefits. Tell us more.
Yes, I have to say it's a rather entertaining tit for tat between the former president Uhuru Kenyatta and the current president William Ruto. Kenyatta has accused the state of withholding part of his retirement package. I think most Kenyans are, I wouldn't say they're as entertained as I am by this. The country is experiencing tax increases. People have less money to spend, but Kenyatta is saying that some of his pension, that's around 9,500 euros a month, has been withheld, that he's not able to pay for his housing allowance, his fuel allowance, his water allowance. And the Kenyan state has hit back and said that they have been paying out quite a lot of money that has allowed Uhuru Kenyatta to be treated abroad, to retain the status that he had before. And I think we'll probably hear more of this. But yeah, this is sort of in all the Kenyan papers today.
Navina, thank you very much indeed. That's Navina Kotor. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The United Nations Security Council on Monday backed a proposal outlined by President Joe Biden for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Cairo, urging both sides to accept the resolution, which was voted for by 14 Security Council members, whilst Russia abstained. New Zealand said today it would send 41 more military personnel to the United Nations mission along the heavily fortified demilitarised zone between North and South Korea, as it looks to step up its role in international missions. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon has been working to increase New Zealand's international engagement since taking office last year, including sending a maritime security team to the Red Sea. And 4 American educators from the small Iowa university were injured in a stabbing attack in a public park in northeastern China's Jilin province on Monday. That's according to US media and government officials. This has not yet been reported in Chinese media, and there have been no statements on the incident issued by Chinese authorities. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Belarus has announced it's joining Russia in drills to practice the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. This is the second time this has happened and comes after it was confirmed last year by Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko that Russia was moving some of its tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. The country borders 3 NATO members, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Well, I'm joined now from Warsaw by Franek Viakorka, who's a journalist from Belarus. He's also chief advisor to the head of the Belarusian Democratic Movement, Svietlana Tsikhanskaya. Franek, very good to have you with us again. Can you just make clear, what is a tactical nuclear weapon? How does it differ from long-range strategic weapons?
Basically, the sense of the tactical nuclear weapons is the same as strategic, but the range of its use and the scale of the explosion is much smaller, and it's much easier to transport such weapons. It's much easier to hide them, and the deployment on the territory of Belarus for Russia is important in order to blackmail the NATO countries. What they are doing, they're trying to conduct drills, they're trying to speak about nuclear weapons every single day in order to scare the West, to scare Ukraine, to escalate the tension between the West and Russia.
And do we have any further details on the joint exercise, where it's taking place, how big it is and so on?
The exercise did not start yet, if we speak about the Belarusian part of the exercise, but the announcement itself is already the form of blackmail. We actually don't have evidence that nukes are on Belarus territory. We have the photos of facilities. We have a lot of media reports from propaganda about the nukes, but we never saw them. Experts never saw them. Journalists and citizen journalists never found any proof. So perhaps it's just the part of the informational psychological campaign.
So, I mean, is there any accurate way of assessing the real risk of nuclear escalation?
Oh, the risk is always there. We are dealing with 2 dictators who are playing all in. And of course, there is such risk if Putin will feel that that's the only way to survive for him and his power. Of course, he might use the tactical nuclear weapons. But at this very moment, we don't see strength in Putin in order to escalate, to open the new front, to start using nuclear weapons, because the retaliation attack will be huge and it will involve all NATO countries, it will involve United States. So it won't be just Ukraine and Russia, it will be the whole world. So I don't think it's possible in the nearest perspective.
Well, what's been the official comment from Belarus on these drills?
Official propaganda are very proud of these drills, are proud of nuclear weapons. For dictator Lukashenko, nuclear weapons was always the dream to have, and he was regretting that Belarus gave up nuclear weapons in 1995, according to Budapest Memorandum. And right now he's using to show his power, to say, oh, I have nuclear weapons. If you are going to impose sanctions on me, I can drop the bomb on your capital. And this is a real talk Lukashenko is doing right now. So we see that propaganda using it in informational campaign primarily against Poland and Lithuania, and the response must be asymmetrical. More sanctions, more pressure, more support for democratic forces, and more support for Ukraine.
If Belarus didn't cooperate with Russia, would it come to the same fate as Ukraine? I mean, how far is this cooperation in the best interests of the country just to avoid being invaded?
I think de facto Belarus is already occupied. It's already subjugated. But in Belarus, Lukashenko gave up the sovereignty in order to receive protection from Putin, and in Ukraine, government stood up with people against the invasion. So Belarus fell down the first victim in this war after 2020, and Ukraine just resists. I think Belarusian underground resistance is still there, but for us, Belarusian people, it's very difficult when you have Russian troops on your territory and when you have huge repressions happening every single day.
Now, we know that Lukashenko said last June that Belarus would use the weapons with no hesitation. He singled out the NATO member and neighbour Poland as a threat. And I know that you're in Warsaw. What is the feeling there?
So me personally, I'm in Vilnius, but we are often traveling to Warsaw, of course, with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the president-elect of Belarus. So I think there is a big fear of the possible escalation, but in Warsaw and Vilnius, Lithuania and Poland, it's not so much actually compared to Western Europe. I think this fear of possible big war is much bigger in the Western Europe. This is where Russian propaganda is efficiently working. And we saw also during elections to European Union that a lot of far-right parties proposing the appeasement with Putin, they won because they're afraid of escalation. But Poland and Lithuania countries understand very well that the only way to stop Putin, to resist, to counter, and to be brave.
And finally, what is your opposition movement for democracy doing to push back against all of this?
So Svetlana Tikhanovskaya formed the government in exile. There is a proto-quasi-parliament. Elections took place just 2 weeks ago. The democratic forces are united, and there is a network inside the country of partisan underground resistance, spreading the news, sabotaging Russian railways or Russian equipment. And outside the country, it's lobbying, advocating for Belarus interests and formalizing a relationship. Today, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya comes to Washington, where she meets Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, Undersecretary, Congress people, senators, also to advocate for democratic Belarus.
Franek, thank you very much indeed. That's Franek Viakorka there. And you're with Monocle Radio. It's 15:37 in Tokyo, 8:37 in Zurich. Yesterday, Japan's Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act came into effect. Well, here to unpick it for us is Richard Lloyd Parry, who's Asia editor of The Times. Richard, welcome to the show. What are these new rules?
Well, the part of the new rules that's getting a lot of attention is a rule about asylum seekers, which says that if asylum seekers are applying for asylum for a third time or more, in other words, if they've already applied and been refused twice before, they can be deported. The government doesn't have to accept their application and process it. Now, to some people, that sounds perfectly reasonable, but others point out that Japan's asylum regime really is extraordinarily restrictive and narrow by the standards of most advanced democracies, G7 countries, and that this is only going to make it harder for people who are at risk in their home countries, whose lives, whose human rights are in danger of jeopardy if they're deported, that they could be put at risk, and this is really unacceptable.
Why have these rules changed now?
Well, because the Japanese Diet has passed this law. The government, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, is a very conservative government. The opposition is weak. There is generally in Japan I suppose you would call it an aversion to large-scale immigration and to giving permanent residence to foreigners. I mean, to give you an idea, last year, Japan received 13,800 applications for asylum, and 303 people got asylum. So that's a little bit more than 2% of the total. Japan's a country of about 122 million people. In the UK, by contrast, a country with half that population, there were 84,500 applications, and of those, 2/3 were granted, only a third were refused. So about 57,000 people were given asylum. In Japan, 303 were. You can see there's a great discrepancy there. And that is because of, generally very different attitudes to immigration broadly, not only from asylum seekers. Japan has a shrinking population, a shrinking labour force of young people, a shrinking pool of young taxpayers to support its growing number of elderly people on pensions and social care. And one obvious solution to this is to bring in immigrants. That's where the shortfall is met in a lot of advanced countries that have similarly shrinking populations. But that's a step that Japan's been very reluctant to make. This is still very much a homogenous, monocultural society. When you walk through the streets of Tokyo or big Japanese cities, and these are huge cities, you see a lot of foreign tourists these days, but there aren't a lot of foreigners who live and work and have made their homes in Japan. And that's part of the social settlement that people in many ways have chosen.
And for the foreigners that do live there, or immigrants, particularly refugees, how are they treated by the authorities in Japan?
You're treated perfectly well once you've got that permission. There is support. Being a refugee and an asylum seeker in any circumstances is never going to be easy. But Japan's not a bad place for that. It's not that people are neglected or mistreated once they're in. The difficulty is getting in the first place. There are enormous obstacles are placed. I mean, I know a lawyer who acts for immigrants who are applying for asylum, and she was telling me recently that she was jubilant that she'd actually got someone in, got an asylum seeker of hers, a client who got asylum. But it took years and, literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of paperwork. It's something that nobody could do on your own. It's only possible if you have lawyers, usually working pro bono to help you jump through all the hoops.
And what are the concerns about the abuse of immigrants' human rights?
How do you mean, Georgina?
Well, so for instance, there are many. We're told, it's reported, that there are concerns over breaches of their human rights in the new legislation. Particularly, the Immigration Service has come under increased scrutiny for lots of failures, including this controversial policy of monitoring immigrants facing deportation. And I understand that there's been quite some pushback on that.
Yeah, once you've come and you've applied, you don't automatically just sort of get to stay and roam free. There are a lot of conditions that have to be met. You have to have guarantors, people who will vouch for you, who will promise to cover your costs and so on. And people who can't do that sometimes end up getting held in, immigration centres, which, they're not the same as prisons, but you're not free to roam. It's obviously not ideal. There have been nasty cases in the past of people in these places being allegedly being abused by the people who run them. But the biggest problem, I think, is that these cases just take a long, long time to be resolved. There isn't a system set up and in place whereby people can make their applications and quickly get an adjudication, a yes or no.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. That's Richard Lloyd Parry there in Tokyo. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Well, it's time now to talk art and culture with the journalist Gabe Bullard, who joins me now from Basel. Gabe, good morning to you. Art Basel preparations are going on. Tell us more.
Yeah, so it's kicking off in a couple days here, and already there's a lot of excitement around town. They have some hotel barges out floating on the Rhine, ready to welcome some visitors as well. But what has really been talked about over the last couple months has been some of this public engagement for folks who are not necessarily in the convention center, maybe walking down to Metzeplatz or even just visiting. There is always the parkour, which is the open air art exhibits. It's about 20-something, and this year they're all lined up through Klein Basel, this one neighborhood going along one path that leads to the center. It's a very busy thoroughfare in Basel, so a lot of people walking, either going into Art Basel or just sort of walking through the city, are going to be seeing a bit more of this public art. So I think that there's a lot more public engagement and sort of driving some of that excitement around the city right now.
What about efforts to engage new audiences, open it up to a different demographic?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. You know, there are new galleries that are displaying, about 22 this time. But also when you see something like in an old storefront, a work of public art, or the Wheatfield Redux that's going on, Agnes Dennis's big installation outside, I think that's something where people who maybe hadn't thought about spending too much time in, or people who are coming for the first time, are seeing that this isn't just an event that's happening inside of the Messeplatz. It's something that takes over the city. It's something that engages with the world around it. You're also seeing a lot more conversation around Basel Social Club, which is this big sort of event that brings in a lot of young people, a lot of excitement and everything. It's going outside as well this year. It's going to be in a big field with farming going on all around it. So I think on the one hand, you could look at this as art thinking about engaging with the environment and climate, but also just about art engaging with the outside world. And I think that's something that is really helping to attract a lot of newer people to Art Basel.
And is it mostly a trade show? Is this about business to business and art buying and selling, or is it about just this wonderful display for the public?
It is business to business. You know, there's a lot of sales, a lot of deals, a lot of conversations among gallerists and everything like that. But I think that you do have to have that public engagement as well to drive interest in going to the galleries year round, to drive interest in building a new generation of art collectors, art appreciators, and people who are going to keep the industry thriving.
Let's talk now about Adobe, because the company is proposing a change to its terms of service, and people are not very happy about it.
Yeah, so I think this is something where it is almost a bridge too far for a lot of users. So Adobe had put out these new terms of service, and there was a line in there that implied to a lot of people perhaps Adobe would be checking in on some of their files that are stored in the cloud, looking in on them. And Adobe has pushed back on this, and they've said, you know, we could have worded this update a little bit differently, but this is pretty standard operating procedure for any company that's hosting a lot of cloud services, for any company doing the work that we're doing to make our tools functional. We need to have this in our terms of service. There's always been something like that in the terms of service. But I think this big backlash that you're seeing now from users has been building for a while, because Adobe has long ago, they switched from buying the software to subscribing to it, which means they can push through some of these updates. And that is really starting to fracture some of the trust with their core audience of creatives. They're worried, is Adobe going to be using my work to train its AI? Is Adobe as private as it needs to be now that everything is operating in the cloud? And so I think a lot of these frustrations that have been building over the years have really spilled over into an argument over what Adobe at least claims is a fairly innocuous terms of service update.
And now let's have a look at English language books becoming more popular abroad, particularly in Scandinavia, the Netherlands and Germany. What's behind that?
Yeah, so this was a very interesting report that the New York Times had picked up on. Just a lot more young people are buying these quickly published English language editions of books that are put out, books originally written in English. And the big driver of this is, one, young people with a better knowledge of English and liking to read in English, even if it's not their native language. But the really big push behind this is social media. Young people want the book covers that they see in popular influencer accounts. They want to be able to converse about the book in English when it's out and have the copy that looks like the copy they're seeing online.
And I wonder how this is knocking then the publishing industry within those countries that are publishing in their own languages.
Yeah, so I think you're seeing some European publishers are worried because they do a brisk business of selling translated works. Authors are likely to be a little bit concerned because the royalties are going to be a little bit lower for some of these quickly published English editions in other countries instead of the translated work. So that's causing a bit of concern there as the market shifts toward just buying more books in English or buying the American or British versions of books.
But it's fantastic that books are being brought and by entirely new people. I mean, this article says that 15-year-olds are back in bookstores.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing is we can have some concerns about translated works and the business side of things. But above all, if you're seeing young people in bookstores, you're seeing young people collecting books, buying books, wanting to build up these big bookshelves in their homes in such a digital age. I don't see how that's bad news.
Absolutely. Reading builds empathy, and empathy, of course, is always a really good thing. Gabe, many thanks to you.
Thank you. That's
Gabe Bullard there from Basel. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, despite being very different organisations, the leading US media outlets, Bloomberg, the New York Post, Associated Press, CNN, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal and The Daily Beast, all have one thing in common. They're run by British editors. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord. Chris, this is actually not new. It was a trend started back in the 1980s with Tina Brown and Anna Wintour. Tell us more.
You're right, Georgina. I mean, look, those two editors that you just mentioned there, still very much part of the American media landscape in many ways. What I think you've seen in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is an increasing fascination amongst a lot of people who own media companies in America, who are American, looking to British editors as a solution to a decline in media landscape, if I'm very honest with you. That a lot of them look to British editors to be able to engineer the kinds of turnarounds that's probably held up as the best example these days is what Mark Thompson, who used to be the Director General of the BBC and came to the New York Times some years ago and is now with CNN. And while he was at the New York Times, Thompson really oversaw a period where not only was he a sort of newsroom-minded leader at that brand, where he could come in and still cared about the journalism and still cared about making sure that the Times was the paper of record in the United States, he also had a keen commercial mind, and he turned what was a pretty bleak state of affairs for the print paper into a very successful model built around digital subscriptions. And whoever you ask in American media, they will all say that Thompson was the person who came in with the vision to give these papers some longevity, this paper some longevity. He's now at CNN, and the hope is the big execs there in CNN, after some pretty torrid years of leadership within CNN, are hoping that Thompson could do the same thing again. There's a few reasons for this, and this does go a bit back to Tina Brown and Anna Wintour. I think a lot of Americans have a slightly rosy-tinted view of British media. Joe Biden has intimated that his favourite newspaper is the Financial Times. The BBC is still held up as a kind of paragon of impartiality and a kind of cultural mediator within British society. Now, if you're from the UK, obviously you see all of this with a little bit more nuance. But I think in America, when they look at the hyper-polarized state of media that's been deregulated, especially in broadcast, for a very long time. They look at Britain and its media landscape as sort of a little bit more in control and a little bit more able to kind of do the impartiality that increasingly so many consumers of the media in America say they wish the media was more that way. As in, so many, if you talk to Americans, so many will say, I wish we had something like the BBC here, because they feel that, and it's not unfair to say that they feel that NPR is too left-wing, or they feel that Fox is too right-wing, and they seek out for something that can be a little bit more of a moderating ground. And so I think there's a story here about decline of media in America and, frankly, the potential that British editors might be able to turn things around.
What have some of the British editors in question said about this?
Well, look, I think, let's just take so Will Lewis is in the news at the moment. He's the chief executive of the Washington Post. He was at the Telegraph for a very long time. And at the moment, there are allegations against Will Lewis that he has offered interviews to journalists in exchange for killing negative stories about him. And, so at the moment, there are a lot of American media sort of types, if you like, the big people within American media who are saying, well, hang on, we've brought large numbers of British editors and execs into our system who have come from Fleet Street, who maybe don't share the same values. I think that's a little bit unfair. These allegations are still floating around about Will and have not been completely confirmed as of yet. But if you just take something that Will Lewis supposedly said to his sort of business superiors within the business at Washington Post, and he was pretty frank about them. He told them, people are not reading your stuff. I can't sugarcoat it anymore. And I think this is partly what's attracting some of these American execs to bring Brits over, is that they're coming in with an outsider perspective who perhaps don't see the same sentimentality when it comes to some of these American media brands. Things like the Washington Post, the New York Times, to some extent CNN and like. These are held up as harking back to a very important era, right through from the middle of the 20th century and onwards, where media so much had a role at holding, essentially truth to power and all that kind of stuff. These are still very important factors in the minds of most Americans. A Brit comes in with a far less sentimental viewpoint, a far more, as you will hear US publishers say, ruthless perspective towards the newsroom at a moment when many are looking to make cuts, and probably difficult cuts to make. I think there's one more point that I would make on that, though, Georgina, and this is something I heard from a US publisher once, and I think there is an element of truth in this, is that a lot of American execs like British journalists because they feel they, first of all, go after the scoop. They know where the newsline is in a story and they go after it. There's a feeling, I think, amongst some American consumers when I talk to them about the way they consume media, they worry that, or they feel that too much in American media, there's a lot of, frankly, narrative nonfiction worked into the news, as in you get into a news story in a paper and it reads like a piece of nonfiction. Well, quite different when you go to Fleet Street. It's a lot more like the news is at the top, the news line is right there, you know why it's an important story. And I urge anybody to compare, just as an example, some of the reporting about this so-called British invasion. Look at the way the Americans are telling this story in their papers. It's so full of colour and narrative and storytelling. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think also there's a slight yearning for a simpler, more direct line to the news from some American media execs, and that's kind of why they're looking to British editors for it.
And just very quickly, as we say, this is not a news story. It started in the 80s. Why is it being reported now?
Well, I think you've got two big forces at work. I think the first is no one can deny the power of the Daily Mail online right now. I mean, this is reaching 225 million visitors every month globally, 75 million of which come from within the United States. This is dwarfing so many of these, legacy media. I mean, the Daily Mail is a legacy media brand, but its presence in the United States, as it is, as a kind of lots of big newsrooms dedicated to that beat, is fairly new.
Chris Lord, thanks very much for joining us here on The Globalist. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Henry Rees-Sheridan and Tom Webb, our researcher, George Ruskin, and our studio manager, Christy O'Grady. After the headlines, there's more music on the way and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.